It wasn't just a medical surplus. It was a biological uprising. How did a military machine capable of feeding millions of men and orchestrating the movement of entire civilizations fail to account for the most basic, recurring reality of the women who kept that machine from collapsing? Why did a system built to survive the crushing weight of industrial artillery surrender to a simple matter of human anatomy? And why did the people meant to be the guardians of health become the first victims of a century-old silence? But that was only the surface. History chooses to remember the roar of the tanks and the strategic genius of the maps, but it completely misses the quiet desperation in the shadows of the triage tents. It ignores the women who were mocked by the very officers they were saving. Women who were expected to be invisible caregivers while fighting a private, unacknowledged war against their own bodies in a wasteland that offered them no quarter. Why did the powerful system ignore the only tactic that could save them? The answer wasn't in the classified vaults, but in the hands of the underdog. October 1917. Flanders, France. To look at the map is to see a line of stalemate. To stand in the mud is to see the end of the world. The landscape of northern France has been stripped of its dignity. The trees are nothing but blackened teeth splintered against a leaden sky. The earth here has been churned so many times by shellfire that it has lost the consistency of soil. It is a viscous, gray soup, a mixture of pulverized limestone, stagnant rain, and the shredded remnants of those who tried to cross it. The air is thick. It carries the metallic tang of iron, the cloying sweetness of gangrene, and the sharp antiseptic bite of carbolic acid that never quite manages to mask the scent of the dying. Inside the casualty clearing stations, the noise is a physical weight. It is not the heroic fanfare of the recruitment posters. It is the rhythmic, wet thud of boots on duckboards, the low, guttural humming of men in shock, and the constant frantic tearing of cotton. But the cotton is failing. For centuries, the world relied on the white harvest of the fields to bind its wounds. But in this war, the wounds are deeper than the history of medicine. A single shrapnel blast doesn't just cut, it excavates. The traditional cotton bandages saturate in minutes. They become heavy, sodden clumps of crimson that lose their grip on the wound, allowing infection to seep in like a thief in the night. The supply lines are choking, ships are sinking. The world is literally running out of bandages to stop its own hemorrhaging. Then, the system introduces a new weapon. It isn't a gun. It is a roll of compressed wood-pulp cellulose, developed in the laboratories of a company called Kimberly-Clark. They call it Cellucotton. At its core, the mechanism is simple. Think of a dry, compressed sponge dropped into a bucket of water. While cotton merely holds liquid on its surface, this cellulose uses capillary action to pull moisture deep into its internal fibers, locking it away. It can absorb 5 times its weight in fluid, and it is half the cost of cotton. To the generals, this was a logistical miracle. It meant they could ship more bandages in less space. It meant surgeons could work faster. But while the military establishment marveled at how this material handled the trauma of the industrial body, they remained willfully blind to the human body. Amongst the chaos, there are thousands of American Red Cross nurses. These women are the silent engine of the Western Front. They work 18-hour shifts on floors slick with fluid. They sleep in unheated tents where the dampness clings to their skin like a shroud. And every month, they face a reality that the War Office refuses to acknowledge. There is no provision for a woman's cycle in a war zone. The Victorian mindset of the High Command treats the biological reality of women as a design flaw, something to be ignored or suppressed through sheer moral character. There are no supplies. There is no privacy. The military hierarchy has mapped every trench, every latrine, and every ammunition dump. But they have left the women who mend the broken soldiers to suffer in a state of primitive, unhygienic desperation. They are expected to be selfless ghosts, saints who do not bleed. The friction between the massive system and the individual was becoming unbearable. One evening, in a dimly lit supply depot near the front, a nurse named Evelyn stands before a mountain of the new Cellucotton rolls. Her feet are numb from the cold. Her back is a knot of constant pain. She has just spent 12 hours watching men breathe their last, and now her own body is demanding a dignity the system has denied her. She is confronted by a young supply officer, a man whose primary concern is the neatness of his ledger and the rigid adherence to the manual. "That material is for surgical trauma only, sister," he says, his voice carrying the practiced arrogance of a man who believes the manual is the universe. Every roll is accounted for by the War Office. It is government property meant for the king's soldiers, not for domestic use. He doesn't use the word. He can't even say it. To him, her need is a glitch in the inventory, a waste of military resources. Evelyn looks at him. She sees the medals on his chest. Medals for a war he watches from behind a desk. She looks at the Cellucotton, a material designed to drink the blood of the dying. And in that moment, she sees the absurdity. The system is willing to spend millions to catch the blood of a man killed by a bullet. But it will not spare a single penny for the health of the woman keeping him alive. "The soldiers are dying because they lack care," she says quietly, her voice steady despite the fatigue. "And they lack care because the women providing it are being treated as if they don't exist." The officer scoffs. He treats the warning as a minor breach of discipline. He believes the hierarchy is too big, too established to be bothered by the complaints of a temp in a veil. He views the silence of the nurses as submission. But he has fatally underestimated his opponent. It wasn't surrender. It was the quiet, cold realization that if the system wouldn't provide for them, they would simply take what they needed from the wreckage of the system itself. While the officers toasted to their logistical efficiency in the mess halls, a microscopic revolution was beginning in the dark of the supply tents. The women were no longer waiting for permission. They were about to hijack the tools of death to ensure their own survival. Spring, 1918. The Marne. The air here has a different weight now. The winter chill has retreated, replaced by a humid, suffocating heat that turns the evacuation hospitals into greenhouses of infection. The German spring offensive is no longer a rumor. It is a physical vibration in the earth that never stops. While the generals in Paris lean over maps, obsessed with the ballistics of the Paris gun and the movement of divisions, the nurses in the field are managing a more intimate kind of chaos. They are the gears in a machine that is grinding itself to pieces. The system is failing. The influx of casualties has reached a point where the manual of supply is no longer a guide, it is a fantasy. The Army surgeons are operating for 20 hours straight, their aprons stiff with dried plasma, while the nurses move in the flickering shadows of kerosene lamps, performing a quiet, frantic triage. In this environment, every resource is a strategic asset. Every roll of gauze is a bullet in the magazine of survival. And yet, amidst this industrial trauma, the nurses are committing what the high command would call a fatal flaw in discipline. They are stealing. They move through the supply depots with the practiced stealth of ghosts. While the medical officers sleep or drink to forget the day's butchery, the women reach for the crates of Cellucotton. They don't take the rolls to the wards. They take them to the back rooms, to the quiet corners where the light doesn't reach. The technical brilliance of this material is its own kind of irony. To understand the black box of this medical failure, one must look at the physics of the fiber. Standard cotton is a tangled mesh of surface fibers that trap liquid until they reach a saturation point, like a wet rag on a tile floor. But Cellucotton is engineered from wood-pulp cellulose. It possesses a tubular capillary structure that acts like a billion tiny siphons, pulling moisture into a central core and locking it away. For the surgeon, this means a wound stays dry for hours. For the woman, it means a revolution. In the silence of the night, with the distant thud of artillery acting as a heartbeat, the nurses begin to engineer their own liberation. They tear the wood pulp sheets. They fold them into precise rectangular pads. They use surgical safety pins and scraps of discarded gauze to create a makeshift garment that the world has never seen. They are using the tools of trauma surgery to solve a centuries-old taboo that the Victorian establishment has deemed unmentionable. But the system does not tolerate deviation. In a small, drafty office near the triage tent, Nurse Clara is confronted by Colonel Brackett, a man who views the hospital as a ledger of costs and the nurses as unfortunate necessities. He has noticed the discrepancy in the supply logs. He has seen the missing rolls of cellulose. "You are treating these supplies as if they are your own personal property, sister," he says. His voice is cold, clipped, the sound of a man who believes that rank is a substitute for understanding. This material is shipped across an ocean at the cost of American lives. It is for the soldiers. It is for the noble wounds of the Republic, not for your personal indispositions. He uses the word like an accusation. To him, the biological reality of these women is a moral failing, a lack of discipline that proper women would simply pray away or ignore. He sees their need as a waste of military resources, a leak in his perfect logistics. "The soldiers are being saved by women who can barely stand," Clara replies. Her voice is a sharp contrast to his low, steady, and exhausted. "If you want us to hold the line, you have to give us the means to exist in it." The colonel scoffs. He treats the warning as a minor breach of etiquette, a symptom of female hysteria brought on by the stress of the front. He believes the hospital's efficiency is a result of his rigid adherence to the manual. But he has fatally underestimated his opponent. It wasn't just the enemy shells that were threatening to collapse his ward. It was the invisible exhaustion of the only people who knew how to run it. He treated the nurse's silence as submission. He didn't realize that the silence wasn't surrender. It was the sound of a secret spreading. By the summer of 1918, the theft is no longer an isolated incident. It is an underground network. While the system screamed in panic as the front lines buckled, the nurses were already in the dark, holding the silence that would save them. They were sharing techniques, passing the folded cellulose pads like contraband, and for the first time in history, they were working without the constant, gnawing fear of shame. They were reclaiming their bodies from a war that wanted to turn them into nameless cogs. The irony is a bitter pill. The very material designed to soak up the blood of a dying empire was becoming the foundation of a new kind of independence. The deadly gap, the space between what the system provided and what the human spirit required, was being bridged by a piece of wood pulp and a woman's ingenuity. Yet, as the war reaches its bloody crescendo, a new danger emerges. The medical officers are starting to notice the improved morale, the lack of fainting spells, the increased endurance of the nursing staff. Instead of seeing a solution, they see a threat to the established order. The chief medical officer dismisses the idea of a specialized hygiene supply as a frivolous domestic distraction from the real war. He believes that the tradition of the service is more important than the survival of the individual. He prepares a formal memorandum to ban the personal use of all surgical materials, intending to restore the dignity of the medical corps. He stands in his office, looking out at the rows of tents, believing he is in total control. He sees the nurses moving with a new, quiet confidence, and he mistakes it for obedience to his latest decree. But the hammer is already in motion. It isn't a military court or a German shell. It is the simple, unstoppable momentum of a discovery that cannot be unmade. While he drafts his prohibition, the nurses are already writing the future. They are no longer just caregivers. They are the first engineers of the modern world. And the system that mocked them is about to realize that the most powerful thing in a war isn't the machine that kills. It's the one that allows you to live. The guns fall silent on November 11th, 1918. But for the accountants at Kimberly-Clark, a different kind of panic is setting in. The war, that ravenous multi-billion-dollar consumer of cellulose, has stopped eating. Suddenly, the massive factory lines in Neenah, Wisconsin, are churning out mountains of Cellucotton with nowhere for it to go. The military contracts are canceled. The government surplus is staggering. To the executives in their mahogany row offices, this isn't just a logistical hiccup. It's a financial death sentence. They are staring at warehouses filled to the rafters with a product designed for a world that no longer exists. But while the board of directors sits in a shroud of cigar smoke, paralyzed by the sudden peace, a quiet report begins to circulate. It's a collection of letters and field notes from the returning Red Cross staff. These documents aren't about the noble, surgical use of cellulose. They are accounts of the theft. The eureka moment doesn't happen in a laboratory. It happens in the ledger. The black box of this corporate survival is simple. The company realized that the nurses hadn't just used the material, they had perfected it. While the experts saw a surplus of dead medical stock, the women had seen a bridge to a modern life. The nurses had already done the market research in the harshest conditions imaginable. The executives, however, are terrified. They are men of the Victorian era, governed by a rigid social manual that dictates what can and cannot be spoken aloud. They believe that a product for that purpose is a moral risk. They claim that the public will be revolted, that the brand will be stained by the mere association with a biological taboo. They prioritize the purity of their corporate image over the desperate demand of half the human race. We cannot put our name on a product that discusses the unmentionable, a senior director scoffs, his voice echoing the same crystallized arrogance as the colonels in the trenches. He treats the nurse's ingenuity as a dirty secret to be buried, rather than a solution to be celebrated. He believes the market will reject any brand that acknowledges the reality of a woman's body. But he has fatally underestimated the hammer of reality. It isn't a social scandal that's coming, it's the roar of the 1920s. The nurses are coming home. They are no longer the subservient girls who left. They have seen the end of the world, and they have no intention of returning to the primitive, restrictive rags of the 19th century. The demand is not coming from a marketing campaign. It is coming from a generation of women who have tasted a small piece of liberation in a box of surgical gauze. In 1921, the company finally blinks. They launch Kotex, a name derived from cotton and texture. The launch is a visceral peak of social friction. The product is placed on pharmacy counters, but it is too scandalous to be discussed with the male clerks. The time freeze moment of the era is a woman standing in a drugstore, silent, dropping a nickel into a black box and taking a plain, unmarked package without saying a single word. The silence of the trench has been replaced by the silence of the retail counter. The success is explosive. Within months, the worthless surplus of the Great War is $1 billion empire. The material that was meant to catch the blood of the dying has become the fuel for the living. It allows women to enter the factories, the offices, and the universities in numbers never seen before. It is the invisible scaffolding of the modern workforce. And here lies the cruel irony. Kimberly-Clark becomes a global titan. The executives who once mocked the indisposition of the nurses are hailed as visionary pioneers of the consumer age. Their names are etched in the annals of business history. Their portraits hang in the halls of industry. But the women, the anonymous nurse in Flanders who first tore the wood-pulp sheet, the woman who risked a reprimand to find a moment of dignity amidst the shrapnel, her name is nowhere. She isn't in the corporate brochures. She isn't in the history books. She is a ghost in the machine. The system stole her improvisation, packaged her necessity, and sold it back to the world, all while erasing her face from the story. If you believe that stories like Evelyn's and the thousands of anonymous nurses deserve to be remembered, join our ranks by subscribing. We live in the echo of that Flanders mud. Every time we benefit from a technology that seems standard, we must ask ourselves, what was the human cost of its silence? The same hubris that allowed the WWWI High Command to ignore the needs of their nurses still exists today. We see it in the design of safety equipment that doesn't fit women, in medical trials that ignore female biology, in systems that treat half the population as a deviation from the male norm. The story of Kotex isn't a story about a product. It's a story about the friction between the human spirit and a system that refuses to see it, It is a reminder that progress is rarely handed down from the top. It is stolen by the underdogs in the dark, born from the wreckage of a world that didn't plan for them to exist. We walk through a world built on their quiet, unacknowledged brilliance. We owe it to them to remember their names, even when the archives do not. Because when we forget the faces of those who improvised our survival, we risk repeating the same arrogance that left them in the mud in the first place. We have synthesized this narrative from reputable historical archives and verified sources. However, the fog of war often extends to the history books. If you spot any inaccuracies or have additional details to share, please correct us in the comments. We strive for the absolute truth, and your knowledge helps us get there. Thank you for keeping history alive.